They say, when death is close, it shows all signs. A whisper here, a moment there. Something so small you almost miss it. Almost. Because looking back now, Chuck Norris was saying goodbye the whole time. We just didn't know how to listen. It was just days before March 19th, 2026, in Hawaii. The sun still warm, the air still easy, and there he was, gloves on, fists moving, sweat on his brow, an 86-year-old man who still punched like the world owed him something. The same man who stared down Bruce Lee on screen. The same man who made Hollywood action what it is today. The same man a whole generation grew up believing was simply too tough to die. And then, mid-punch, he paused, caught his breath, and said something that nobody in that room fully understood in that moment. He said, "I don't age. I level up." The room smiled, maybe laughed a little, because that was Chuck Norris. That was always Chuck Norris. But now, standing on the other side of March 19th, those words don't sound like confidence anymore. They sound like a man who already knew, a man who had already made his peace, a legend quietly telling the world, in the only language he ever spoke, the language of strength, that he was ready. 3 days later, the punching stopped forever. Chuck Norris was gone. Welcome to Stardom Gossip, the one place where legends are never forgotten and every story is told the way it deserves to be told, with truth, with depth, and with the respect that only real fans can give. If you're new here, do me a small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you turn on that notification bell. Every single bell option if you can, because trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next on this channel. And one more thing, drop a comment right now and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one, every single one. Welcome to Stardom Gossip. Let's get into it. You know, there are certain names in this world that stop feeling like names after a while. They stop being something you call a person and start becoming something bigger, something that represents an idea, a feeling, a standard that the rest of the world measures itself against without even realizing it. Names like that don't belong to one country or one generation. They belong to everybody. They belong to history itself. Chuck Norris is one of those names. And on the 19th of March, 2026, that name was delivered a blow it could not recover from. Not a roundhouse kick, not a Hollywood villain, not age, not illness. Just the quiet, unbothered, unstoppable force that comes for all of us eventually, no matter how strong we are, no matter how hard we train, no matter how many times the world has told us we are invincible. A death came for Chuck Norris, and for the first time in his entire life, Chuck Norris lost. But before we get to that Thursday morning in Hawaii, before we talk about the silence that fell over the world when his family made that announcement on March 20th, before we talk about the tears, the tributes, the millions of fans who stared at their phones in complete disbelief, we need to go back, way back, because the story of how Chuck Norris died cannot be told without first telling the story of how Chuck Norris lived. And that story starts in a place you would never expect. Ryan, Oklahoma, 1940. A town so small, so quiet, so far removed from the bright lights of Hollywood that it barely appears on most maps. This is where Carlos Ray Norris came into the world. That was his real name, Carlos Ray Norris. Not Chuck, not the legend, not the myth. Just a boy. A shy, skinny, quiet little boy born to a mother who worked herself to the bone and a father who struggled with demons he could never quite shake. A boy who grew up watching his family scrape and sacrifice just to survive. A boy who knew what it felt like to have less than enough. To want more than the world seemed willing to give him. And yet, there was something in that boy. Something that poverty could not touch. something that a difficult childhood could not break, a stubbornness, a fire, a deep, unshakable belief that if he just worked hard enough, if he just refused to give up long enough, something good would eventually have to happen. Most people who grow up the way Chuck grew up either let it defeat them or let it define them in bitterness. Chuck Norris did something different. He let it fuel him, our every single day for the rest of his life. When he was 18 years old, he joined the United States Air Force. A young man searching for direction, searching for discipline, searching for something to pour that fire inside him into. And it was there, stationed in South Korea, that he found the thing that would change his life forever. Martial arts. Tang Soo Do, to be specific. A Korean form of combat that was as much about the mind and the spirit as it was about the body. Chuck Norris didn't just learn it. He absorbed it. He breathed it. He woke up before everyone else and trained when everyone else was sleeping. He was not the most naturally gifted student in the room, but he was without question the most committed. And in martial arts, just like in life, commitment beats talent every single time. He came back from Korea a different man, quieter on the outside maybe, but burning brighter on the inside than ever before. He opened his own martial arts schools. He competed. He won. He became a 6-time undefeated middleweight karate champion at a time when sport karate in America was still finding its feet. He trained celebrities. He built a reputation. And somewhere along the way, Hollywood noticed. Now let's be clear about something. Chuck Norris did not walk into Hollywood and charm his way to the top with a smile and good looks. That is not who he was. He was not the smoothest talker in the room. He was not the most polished actor when he started. What he was real. Completely, undeniably, refreshingly real. In a world full of manufactured stars and carefully packaged images, Chuck Norris walked into every room exactly as he was. A fighter, a warrior, a man whose hands had been through real combat and whose eyes carried the weight of someone who had genuinely earned everything he had. And the camera loved him for it. His early films were raw, action-packed, unapologetic. Movies like Way of the Dragon, where he shared the screen with the greatest martial artist who ever lived, Bruce Lee himself. Think about that for a moment. Bruce Lee. The man who was so fast, so precise, so otherworldly in his movement that filmmakers had to slow down footage just so audiences could see what he was doing. And Chuck Norris stood across from him, toe to toe, not as a sidekick, not as a supporting role, as the opponent, as the equal, as the man Bruce Lee himself chose to be his final on-screen adversary. And that moment alone would have been enough to cement anyone's legacy forever. But for Chuck Norris, it was just the beginning. Missing in Action, Code of Silence, Invasion USA, The Delta Force, Lone Wolf McQuade. Film after film after film, Chuck Norris built an action movie empire that defined an entire era of cinema. He wasn't just a star, he was a genre. He was the standard against which every action hero of his generation was measured. And he did it all while remaining one of the most grounded, most genuine, most deeply values-driven men in the entire entertainment industry. His faith was real. His love for his family was real. His commitment to the military and to veterans was real. Everything about Chuck Norris was real. And then came Walker, Texas Ranger, 8 seasons, from 1993 to 2001. A television institution that turned Chuck Norris from a movie star into a household name in every corner of the world. Walker was not just a character. Walker was Chuck Norris with a badge and a Stetson hat. Tough, fair, uncompromising. A man who believed in doing right even when doing right was the harder road. Children grew up watching Walker. Parents watched it with their kids. Grandparents never missed an episode. It was the kind of show that brought families together on a Saturday night and reminded them that good still existed in the world, that one man with enough courage and enough conviction could still make a difference. That was the legacy Chuck Norris carried into his later years. That was the weight of love and admiration that sat on his shoulders as he grew older. And what did he do with it? Did he slow down? Did he retreat quietly into the comfort of retirement, the way most men his age would have every right to do? Did he let the years catch up with him and settle into a gentle, peaceful distance from the world that had given him so much? No. Chuck Norris kept training. Chuck Norris kept showing up. Chuck Norris kept throwing punches at 70, at 75, at 80, at 85 years old, with the same intensity, the same focus, the same refusal to surrender that had defined every single chapter of his extraordinary life. Because for Chuck Norris, stopping was never an option. Slowing down was never an option. The only direction he had ever known was forward. And on the 10th of March, 2026, 9 days before the world would lose him forever, Chuck Norris turned 86 years old. And he did something that felt so perfectly, so beautifully, so heartbreakingly him. He looked into the camera. He faced the world that had loved him for decades, and he told everyone who was watching that he was in good health, that he was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. The world exhaled. Of course he was fine. This was Chuck Norris. This was the man the internet had spent 20 years joking could never die. This was the man whose very existence felt like a permanent fixture of the universe. Of course he was fine. But somewhere behind that smile, somewhere in the quiet moments that the camera never caught, somewhere in the still, private hours of a man who had lived long enough to understand things the rest of us are still learning, something was shifting. Something was closing. Something was preparing itself for a journey that not even Chuck Norris, with all his strength, with all his discipline, with all his unbreakable warrior spirit, could train his way out of. The signs were there. They are always there. We just never know how to read them until it is already too late. And in just a few days, the whole world would find out exactly what those signs had been saying all along. There is a particular kind of peace that comes to certain people in their final days. A settling, a softening around the edges. Like the world has gone just quiet enough for them to finally hear something they have been too busy to listen to for their entire lives. People who have stood close to death and lived to describe it often talk about this. A strange calm, a clarity, a sense of things falling into place that had never quite fit together before. Looking back now, those who were closest to Chuck Norris in those final days speak of something similar, something they could not name in the moment, something that only makes sense now, standing on the other side of March 19th, trying to piece together the last chapter of a life that felt like it was written to last forever. Because here is what we know. And what we know is enough to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you sit with it long enough. 9 days before he died, Chuck Norris celebrated his 86th birthday, and not privately, not quietly tucked away from the world in the way that a man of his age and stature could have easily chosen. He faced the world. He looked into the camera. He smiled that smile that 3 generations of fans had grown up trusting. And he said the words that would later become one of the most bittersweet things anyone had heard in a long time. He said he was in good health, that he was doing well, that everything was fine, and the world believed him. Because why wouldn't they? This was a man who had been defying expectations his entire life. This was a man who had been training his body since his teenage years in Korea. And this was a man whose discipline was so complete, so total, so deeply woven into the fabric of who he was that his body had become almost a separate entity from the rest of us, something governed by different rules, subject to different limitations, operating on a level that ordinary biology simply could not explain. When Chuck Norris said he was fine, the world nodded and moved on. Because of course he was fine. He was always fine. He would always be fine. But time does not negotiate. Not with legends, not with warriors, not with men who have spent 86 years refusing to bow to anything. Time simply waits. patient, unhurried, completely certain of its own outcome. And in those 9 days between his birthday and the morning of March 19th, time was waiting for Chuck Norris. He was in Hawaii. Let that image sit with you for a moment. Hawaii, one of the most breathtakingly beautiful places on the face of this earth. A place of sunsets that look like they were painted by hand. A place where the ocean stretches out so wide and so blue that standing at its edge makes you feel both impossibly small and strangely at peace all at once. A place where the air itself seems to carry something healing in it. Something ancient. Something that whispers to the deepest part of you that everything is going to be all right. Was it a vacation? A retreat? A quiet escape from the noise of the world for a man who had spent decades living inside that noise? We don't know everything. But what we do know is that Chuck Norris was not sitting still. Chuck Norris was never sitting still. Because even in Hawaii, even at 86 years old, even with the whole Pacific Ocean spread out before him like an invitation to simply rest, Chuck Norris was training. Of course he was training. Gloves on, fists moving, body in motion. The same ritual he had performed thousands upon thousands of times across more than 6 decades of his life. The same ritual that had taken a shy boy from Oklahoma and turned him into one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. There is something almost sacred about that image when you think about it now. A man in his final days, still showing up, still doing the work, still refusing to let age or time or the quiet voice that must have been whispering somewhere in the back of his mind change who he fundamentally was. He was sparring. Moving around the way only someone with his level of mastery can move. Not frantically, not forcefully, but with an ease that comes from so many years of practice that the body no longer has to think about what it is doing. It just moves. It just knows. And in between the punches, in between the rhythm of gloves cutting through the warm Hawaiian air, he paused, he caught his breath, and he said something. 7 words. Just 7 words. The kind of sentence that in any other moment on any other day from any other person would have sounded like nothing more than a bit of playful confidence. A joke, almost. The kind of thing you laugh at and forget about before the echo has even finished bouncing off the walls. But these words did not come from just any person. They came from a man who 3 days later would be gone. He looked up, and he said, "I don't age. I level up." The room smiled. Of course the room smiled. Because that was pure Chuck Norris. That was the man they knew and loved speaking in the only language he had ever been fully comfortable in. The language of strength, of resilience, of forward motion, no matter what. Nobody in that room heard a goodbye in those words. Nobody heard a farewell. Nobody stopped and looked at each other with wide eyes and whispered that something felt different about the way he said it. They just smiled, and the training continued. But now that we know what happened 3 days later, go back to those 7 words. Say them slowly. I don't age. I level up. Listen to them not as a joke, not as a boast, not as the kind of thing a tough guy says to make people around him laugh. Listen to them as the words of a man who had spent 86 years preparing himself for every challenge life could throw at him, and a man of deep faith. A man who had thought seriously and sincerely about what came after this life. A man who believed, truly believed, that what waited on the other side of this world was not an ending but a transition. I don't age, I level up. Was it a coincidence? Was it just something he said in the moment, the way all of us say things in the moment that mean nothing more than what they appear to mean on the surface? Maybe. Probably even. Chuck Norris was not the kind of man to speak in riddles or hidden meanings. He was direct. He was straightforward. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. But grief has a way of reaching back into the past and finding the moments that felt ordinary and making them feel extraordinary. And those 7 words, in the days and weeks since March 19th, and have taken on a weight that nobody who heard them in that Hawaiian training room could have possibly anticipated. Because 3 days after he said them, Chuck Norris stopped aging entirely. The day before he died, a source close to him shared something that only deepened the ache of what was coming. They said that Chuck had been in an upbeat mood, that he had been working out, that he had been the same Chuck Norris he had always been, energetic, focused, present. There was no sense of decline, no dramatic farewell, no moment where he gathered people around him and said the things people say when they know their time is running short. He was just there, fully there, the way he had always been fully there in everything he ever did. That is perhaps the hardest part of this entire story. Not that Chuck Norris died. A death comes for all of us, and there is a dignity in accepting that truth even as it breaks your heart. The hardest part is that there was no warning anyone could have acted on. No final conversation that people knew was a final conversation. No last hug that anyone held a little longer because they understood what it was. The people around him in those last days were just living, just laughing, just being in the presence of a man they loved and assumed they would continue to love for years still to come. And then, Thursday morning came. March 19th, 2026. Hawaii. The sun rising over the Pacific the way it always does, completely indifferent to what is about to happen on the shore beneath it. And somewhere in that paradise, in that place of impossible beauty and ancient peace, Chuck Norris suffered a medical emergency. The details, but as they always are in these sacred and private moments, belong first and foremost to the family who lived through them. But what his family later shared with the world was this, that he was surrounded by the people he loved, that he was at peace, that in his final moments the man who had spent a lifetime fighting did not have to fight. He just let go. Carlos Ray Norris, born March 10th, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma. The shy boy who became a champion, the champion who became a movie star, the movie star who became a legend, the legend who became something bigger than any single word can contain. Gone. March 19th, 2026, Hawaii. And the world that had spent 20 years joking that Chuck Norris could never die, finally had to face the truth that every heart already knew, but every mind had refused to accept. That he was human after all, beautifully, powerfully, extraordinarily human. And the silence that followed that realization was the loudest thing most of his fans had ever heard. There is a moment that happens on the internet when someone truly legendary dies, not just famous, not just well-known, truly legendary. It is a moment that is almost impossible to describe unless you have witnessed it. Everything stops, not physically. The world keeps spinning. Cars keep moving. People keep going about their days, but in the invisible space where human beings connect with each other across cities and countries and continents and time zones, everything just stops. It happened when Michael Jackson died. It happened when Kobe Bryant died. It happened when Muhammad Ali left this world. And on the morning of Friday, March 20th, 2026, when the family of Chuck Norris sat down in their grief and their love and their loss and found the words to tell the rest of the world what had happened the day before in Hawaii, it had happened again. The announcement was simple, the way the most devastating announcements always are. No dramatic press release, no carefully managed media rollout, just a family, broken and brave at the same time, telling the truth. Chuck Norris was gone. He had passed suddenly. He had been surrounded by the people he loved. He had been at peace. Simple words, quiet words, words that carried the weight of an entire world inside them. And then the internet broke. Within minutes, not hours, not days, minutes, the name Chuck Norris was everywhere, trending in every country, lighting up every platform, flooding every feed, from Los Angeles to London, from Tokyo to Lagos, from Sao Paulo to Sydney. From the smallest towns in the American Midwest, where families had gathered every Saturday night for 8 years to watch Walker, Texas Ranger together, to the biggest cities in Asia, where his action movies had played in packed cinemas to audiences who didn't even speak English but understood every single thing he was saying with his fists and his presence and his eyes. The tributes came like a flood. Like a dam had broken somewhere, and everything that millions of people had ever felt about this man came pouring out all at once with nowhere left to hold it. Fellow action stars who had grown up watching him and been shaped by what he represented stepped forward one by one. Directors who had worked with him. Co-stars who had stood beside him on set and seen up close what it looked like when a man brought his whole self to everything he did. Veterans and military families who had felt seen and honored by his lifelong commitment to their service. Martial artists from every discipline and every corner of the world who recognized in Chuck Norris one of the people responsible for bringing their craft to a global audience and giving it the respect it deserved. And then there were the ordinary people, the ones who had never met him, the ones who would never meet him, the ones whose connection to Chuck Norris existed entirely through a screen, through a television set in a living room 30 years ago, through a VHS tape worn thin from too many viewings, through a movie night with a father or a grandfather who said, "Watch this, just watch this. You'll understand when you see it." Those people came forward too. And what they said was perhaps the most moving of all. Because what they said was not just, "I loved his movies," or "he was a great actor," or "he was so talented." What they said went deeper than that. What they said was, "He made me feel like the good guy could still win. He made me feel like strength and honor and doing the right thing were still worth something in this world. He made me feel, when I was a kid watching Walker take down criminals and protect the innocent and never once compromise on what he believed in, that the world still had people in it worth believing in. That is not a small thing. That is not the legacy of just an entertainer. That is the legacy of someone who reached through the screen and touched something real in the hearts of the people watching. Something that needed to be touched. Something that needed to be reminded it was still alive. And the Chuck Norris jokes. Oh, the Chuck Norris jokes. Those legendary, ridiculous, endlessly creative celebrations of a man so extraordinary that ordinary humor could not contain him. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. Chuck Norris counted to infinity. Twice. Chuck Norris can divide by 0. Those jokes had been circulating for 20 years, passed from person to person across generations like a kind of folklore, a mythology built around a living man who had somehow become larger than life while still being completely, genuinely, accessibly human. In the hours after the announcement of his death, those jokes took on a new and achingly beautiful dimension. People shared them not as punchlines anymore, but as love letters. As a way of saying, "We saw you. We celebrated you. We built an entire language of admiration around you because the regular words were never quite big enough for what you were to us." The laughter that had always surrounded Chuck Norris in life became, in death, one of the most touching expressions of grief the internet had ever witnessed. Because every joke was really just another way of saying, "We cannot believe you are gone. We refuse to believe the world is smaller now that you have left it." But perhaps the moment that hit hardest, perhaps the single detail that stopped people mid-scroll and made them put their phones down and just sit with the weight of it for a moment, was this. 9 days before he died. On his 86th birthday, Chuck Norris had posted to the world that he was in good health. And just days before the end, "I'm in a training room in Hawaii, with his gloves on and his fists still moving and his body still doing the thing it had been doing for more than 6 decades. He had looked up from his sparring and said 7 words that nobody in that room knew would one day be the last words the world would hold on to. I don't age. I level up. Read the comments under that story when it spread across the internet after his passing. Read what people wrote. Grown men and women openly weeping in comment sections. People saying they had to pull over their cars because they couldn't see through the tears well enough to drive. Parents telling their children about Chuck Norris for the first time and crying while they did it because they suddenly realized how much he had meant to them without ever having fully understood it while he was still alive. That is what real legacy looks like. Not the awards, not the box office numbers, not the television ratings or the martial arts titles or the Hollywood Walk of Fame star. Real legacy looks like a stranger on the other side of the world reading 7 words spoken by a man they never met and feeling their chest cave in. I don't age, I level up. In the days that followed the announcement, tributes continued to pour in from every direction. Flags were flown at half-mast at martial arts schools across America. Reruns of Walker, Texas Ranger trended on every streaming platform as millions of people went back to the beginning, wanting to sit with him one more time, wanting to hear that theme song one more time, wanting to watch him ride across the Texas landscape one more time before the reality of his absence fully settled in. But his films climbed back up the rental charts. His autobiography flew off digital shelves. People who had never seen a single Chuck Norris movie watched one for the first time just to understand what the grief was about, and came away understanding completely. His family, in the days after the announcement, asked for privacy and for peace, and the world, out of love and out of respect for a man who had given so much of himself to so many for so long, tried its very best to give them that. Because that is what you do for someone who spent their life giving. You give back the only thing you have left to give: space, and silence, and gratitude. Chuck Norris was not just a celebrity. He was not just an action star. He was not just a martial artist or a television icon or an internet legend. He was a man who came from nothing and built something so real, so lasting, so deeply human that it will outlive every single person who is watching this right now. He was proof that discipline is more powerful than circumstance, that character is more valuable than talent, that showing up every single day for your whole life, no matter what, is the closest thing to immortality that any of us will ever find. He was born in a small town that nobody had ever heard of. He died in paradise, surrounded by love, and in between those two moments, he lived more fully, more completely, more honestly than almost anyone who has ever walked across the surface of this earth. Carlos Ray Norris. March 10th, 1940. March 19th, 2026. He didn't age. He leveled up. Rest easy, Walker. The world is a little less tough without you in it. But it is immeasurably richer for every single year that you were. This has been Stardom Gossip. If this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, leave a comment below and tell me what Chuck Norris meant to you. Tell me your favorite memory. Tell me where in the world you are watching from. Because stories like this one deserve to be shared, and legends like this one deserve to be remembered forever.